It is the sound every Royal Air Force pilot nightmares about. It isn't the rattle of German machine gun fire tearing through the fuselage. It isn't the scream of the wind. It is the silence. Imagine you are at 15,000 feet. You are strapped into a Hurricane, the pride of the British fleet. Below you, you spot a German Messerschmitt Bf-109. He is your target. You have the altitude. You have the advantage. You push the stick forward to dive, ready to unleash hell. And then, nothing. Your engine cuts out. The roar of the Rolls-Royce Merlin turns into a dead, coughing sputter. For 1.5 seconds, you are not flying a fighter plane. You are falling in a 3-ton brick. In that 1.5 seconds, the German pilot doesn't panic. He looks up. He sees your propeller windmilling. He knows exactly what happened. He pulls back on his stick, loops around, and shreds your defenseless aircraft to pieces. This was the terrifying reality over the English Channel in early 1941. The British were losing planes, not because of bad pilots, but because of a flaw in physics. And down on the ground, at RAF Kenley, one woman was standing on the freezing tarmac, holding a solution that cost less than a cup of coffee. She was watching a pilot named Squadron Leader Davies climb into his cockpit. She knew that in 20 minutes, he would be dead, or he would be a legend. And the difference between those two outcomes came down to a tiny 50-cent metal washer she had hidden in her leather satchel. This is the story of Beatrice Schilling, and how she used a piece of brass the size of a thimble to save the free world. To understand why this tiny piece of metal mattered so much, you have to understand the slaughter happening in the skies. By March of 1941, the Battle of Britain was technically over, but the killing hadn't stopped. The Luftwaffe was sending fighters across the Channel every day. In just 1 week, 43 German Bf-109 seconds had crossed over. The RAF engaged them in 27 separate dogfights. The results were grim. 14 Hurricanes lost, 9 Spitfires down. The pilots were furious. They knew the Spitfire was faster. They knew the Hurricane was tougher. But the German planes had a secret weapon under the hood: fuel injection. Their Daimler-Benz engines didn't care about gravity. A German pilot could dive, roll, fly upside down, and do cartwheels in the sky, and his engine would keep screaming at full power. The British engines were different. They used carburetors. It was old technology. Inside the engine, there was a float chamber. Think of it like the tank in the back of a toilet. It relies on gravity to tell it how much fuel to let in. When a British pilot pushed the nose down into a steep dive, gravity effectively reversed. The fuel in that chamber didn't know where to go. It surged to the top, flooding the system. The engine choked on too much gas. It was simple, brutal physics. The pilot would push into a dive, the engine would die, and he would have to wait. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. That was the gap. That was the kill zone. The Germans called it a turkey shoot. Beatrice Schilling had read the reports. She was 32 years old, working for the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Most of the men at the base thought she was a secretary. They saw a woman in a skirt and assumed she was there to type memos. They were wrong. Beatrice was a racer. Since she was 14 years old, she had been tearing engines apart. She bought her first motorcycle as a teenager, stripped it down to the bolts, and rebuilt it just to see how it worked. By the time she was 25, she was racing a Norton motorcycle at Brooklands, hitting average speeds of 106 miles per hour. She was one of only 3 women in history to earn the Gold Star for speed. She didn't just understand engines on paper, she felt them in her bones. She knew what happens to a machine when you push it to the breaking point because she had lived on that edge her entire life. While the top brass at Rolls-Royce were trying to design a massive, complex new carburetor to fix the problem, a solution that wouldn't be ready until 1943, Beatrice looked at the problem differently. The war wouldn't wait for 1943. Pilots were dying today. She looked at the flooding issue and asked a simple question. If the fuel is flooding the engine during a dive, why don't we just stop the fuel from rushing in? We don't need a new engine, we just need a gatekeeper. Her solution was almost insulting in its simplicity. She took a small brass disc. She drilled a hole in the center. It had to be precise. If the hole was too big, the engine would still flood. If it was too small, the engine would starve and stall at full power. She tested 17 different sizes before she found the magic number. a hole exactly 0.04 inches wide. That was it. A tiny brass washer, a restrictor. It would sit in the fuel line and physically prevent the gas from surging when the plane dove. She had tested it on the ground. It worked on the bench. But a bench doesn't shoot back. A bench isn't pulling negative G-forces at 300 miles per hour over the cold waters of the Channel. She needed a test pilot. But there was a problem. Modifying a Royal Air Force fighter plane without official authorization was illegal. It violated about 40 different military regulations. If she installed this unauthorized part and the pilot died, Beatrice wouldn't just be fired. She would face a court-martial. She could go to prison. On the morning of March 14th, she decided she didn't care. She rode her motorcycle to RAF Kenley. She found Sergeant William Cooper, a ground crew mechanic who had seen 19 of his pilots die in 6 months. He was tired of writing letters to mothers. Beatrice showed him the washer. She explained the physics. She didn't have paperwork. She didn't have a command order. She just had a theory and a piece of brass. Cooper looked at her. He looked at the washer, and he opened his toolbox. They walked out to the Hurricane sitting on the tarmac. Inside was Squadron Leader Davies, a 24-year-old ace with 41 missions under his belt. He was warming up the engine. Cooper signaled him to cut it. He worked fast. He disconnected the fuel line, slipped the brass washer in, and welded it shut with a butane torch. It took 60 seconds. It was invisible. Unless you knew it was there, the plane looked exactly the same. Davies didn't know. Beatrice hadn't told him. If she told him, he might hesitate. He might fly differently. She needed him to fly aggressively. She needed him to try a dive. The engine roared back to life. Davies gave a thumbs up and taxied to the runway. Beatrice stood by her motorcycle, clutching her binoculars. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She watched the Hurricane lift off the ground, retract its gear, and bank toward the coast. She was an engineer, a woman of science and math. But as that plane disappeared into the clouds, she realized she had just gambled a man's life on a 50-cent piece of metal. Up in the air, Davies climbed to 15,000 feet. He was joined by 2 other Hurricanes. They were patrolling near Dungeness, a hotspot for German activity. Beatrice waited. 10 minutes passed. Then, 20. The airfield was bustling with noise fuel trucks, shouting mechanics. But Beatrice heard none of it. She was running the flow rates in her head, 0.04 inches. Was it enough? Was it too much? 40 minutes. Still no radio contact. In the silence, doubts started to creep in. Had the weld held? Did the washer block the fuel too much? Was Davies currently gliding into a French field with a dead engine? Then, the radio crackled. 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Beatrice raised her binoculars. She saw 3 specks against the grey sky. They were in formation. All 3 engines were running. Davies brought his Hurricane in for a landing. The wheels touched down, and he taxied toward the dispersal point. He cut the engine. The propeller slowed to a halt. Beatrice walked toward the plane. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to shove them into her pockets. She had designed bombs before. She had tested dangerous equipment, but she had never felt terror like this. Davies slid the canopy back and pulled off his leather helmet. Pilots usually looked exhausted after a patrol. Their eyes would be hollow, their adrenaline crashed, but Davies looked different. He looked electric. Sergeant Cooper ran up to the wing. He asked the question Beatrice couldn't voice. "Any trouble with the engine, sir?" Davies looked at the mechanic. Then he looked at Beatrice. A slow grin spread across his face. "Best the Merlin has ever run," he said. He climbed down and told them what happened. He had spotted 2 Messerschmitts over Dungeness. They were flying low, heading back to France. Usually, this was the moment a British pilot would have to be careful, but Davies had the advantage. He tipped the nose over and dove. He hit 400 miles per hour. The G-forces were so strong they lifted him out of his seat against the straps. He waited for the engine to cut out. He waited for that terrifying silence. It never came. The engine screamed through the entire dive. It didn't cough. It didn't sputter. Davies closed the distance to 200 yards, lined up the German fighter, and fired a 3-second burst. He saw pieces of the enemy plane fly off before the German broke right and ran for his life. For the first time in 11 months, Davies had fought the plane, not the engine. He looked at Beatrice and asked what they had done to his aircraft. When she explained it, the washer, the restriction, the unauthorized modification, Davies didn't get angry about regulations. He didn't ask for permission from the Air Ministry. He turned to Cooper and gave an order that would change the course of the air war. Put that thing in every Hurricane on this station, today. The word spread like wildfire. Pilots talk. Within 48 hours, Beatrice received 14 phone calls from other squadron commanders. They didn't care about the paperwork. They wanted the washer, but there was a logistical nightmare ahead. Beatrice had made 6 of these washers by hand in her workshop. There were thousands of fighter planes in the Royal Air Force. They needed them mass-produced, and they needed them installed yesterday. Beatrice loaded up her Norton motorcycle. She had a bag full of tools, a few dozen prototype washers, and a list of every fighter base in southern England. She was about to go on a tour that would become legendary among the ground crews. She was going to save the RAF, one washer at a time. Beatrice Schilling was now fighting a different kind of war. It wasn't fought with bullets or bombs, but with speed, stamina, and a welding torch. The approval from the Air Ministry had come through in record time, 4 days. They called it a war-winning modification. Rolls-Royce was immediately contracted to crank out 500 of these brass washers a week. But factories take time to spin up, and shipping takes days the RAF didn't have. So, Beatrice didn't wait for the supply trucks. She loaded her saddlebags with every restrictor she could get her hands on, kicked her Norton motorcycle into gear, and headed north toward Biggin Hill. Biggin Hill wasn't just an airfield. It was the bleeding heart of Fighter Command. It was the busiest station in 11 Group, 32 Spitfires, 21 Hurricanes, and 4 squadrons that were rotating through combat so fast the engines barely had time to cool down between sorties. When Beatrice arrived at the gate at 0800 on March 26, the mood on the base was grim. The station commander, Group Captain Grace, met her. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. He told her the numbers flat out. He had lost 7 pilots to engine failure in just 2 months. 7 young men, gone, not because they were outflown, but because their machines had quit on them. He didn't care who Beatrice was. He didn't care about protocol. He just asked, "Can you fix it?" Beatrice didn't waste time with promises. She set up a workshop right on the flight line. The process became a high-stakes assembly line. The ground crews worked in shifts, pulling 4 aircraft at a time off the readiness line. The clock was always ticking. If the scramble alarm sounded, those planes needed to be in the air, not in pieces on the tarmac. They got the timing down to 12 minutes per plane. 12 minutes to save a life. Disconnect the fuel line. Slide the restrictor in. Weld it shut. Reconnect. Test for leaks. That welding step was the moment of truth. It had to be perfect. A sloppy weld could crack under the vibration of a dogfight. A pinhole leak could spray high-octane aviation fuel onto a hot engine block, turning the pilot into a fireball. Beatrice supervised every single one. She was on her hands and knees on the oil-stained concrete, inspecting the beads of the welds, checking the connections. She rejected 3 restrictors that morning because they didn't meet her standards. The mechanics grumbled, but Beatrice stood her ground. She knew that good enough was just another way of saying dead pilot. The pilots, the ones whose lives actually hung in the balance, watched all of this with intense curiosity. One of them was Flight Lieutenant James Lacey. He was a veteran with 41 combat missions. He had felt that sickening silence of a stalled engine twice before, both times with a German fighter on his tail. He walked over to where Beatrice was working. Lacey wasn't just a pilot. He was an engineering graduate from Cambridge. He looked at the tiny brass washer in Beatrice's hand. It seemed too small, too insignificant to solve a problem that had baffled the greatest minds at Rolls-Royce. "How?" he asked. "How does that little thing stop the flooding?" Beatrice didn't dumb it down. She talked to him like an engineer. She explained the fluid dynamics, the restriction of flow during negative G-force, the balance between starvation and flooding. Lacey listened, his eyes narrowing as he processed the math. Then he smiled. "Brilliant simplicity," he said. By the evening of March 28th, every single one of the 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill had the restrictor installed. Beatrice didn't rest. She got back on her motorcycle and rode to Hornchurch, then North Weald, then Tangmere. It was a grueling marathon. She was sleeping in barracks, eating in mess halls, and breathing exhaust fumes 12 hours a day. But at every station, the pattern was the same. Skepticism, then hope, then results. The pilots began to notice the change immediately. It wasn't just that the engines didn't stop, it was that the fear disappeared. Before the restrictor, every British pilot had a hesitation in the back of his mind. A tiny voice that said, "Don't push it too hard. Don't dive too steep." That split-second hesitation was often the difference between getting a kill and getting killed. With the washer installed, the hesitation vanished. They started calling it Miss Schilling's orifice. The nickname came from Sir Stanley Hooker at Rolls-Royce. It was crude. It was classic British military humour. And it was slightly inappropriate. In the polite society of 1942 England, you didn't talk about a lady's orifice. But Beatrice Schilling wasn't interested in polite society. She had spent 6 years working with roughneck mechanics and combat pilots. She knew how men dealt with the stress of death. They made jokes. They found humour in the dark. If calling it Miss Schilling's orifice made them remember it, she didn't care. She wore the nickname like a badge of honour. By April, the name had spread across the entire Royal Air Force. Pilots were refusing to fly missions unless their plane had the orifice installed. Squadron commanders were demanding it. It became the most requested item in fighter command. And then, the Germans noticed, high above the channel, the dynamic of the dogfight shifted. For months, Luftwaffe pilots had relied on a standard escape maneuver. If a Spitfire got behind them, the German pilot would simply push his stick forward and dive hard. He knew the Spitfire couldn't follow. He knew the British engine would choke. It was his get-out-of-jail-free card. In early April, a group of Bf-109 seconds tried this over the coast of France. They spotted British fighters, realized they were in a bad position, and executed the split-S dive, expecting the RAF to break off. But the Spitfires didn't break off. The British planes rolled over and followed them down, engines screaming, guns blazing. The German pilots must have had a moment of pure, frozen shock. The turkey shoot was over. The British were sticking to their tails like glue. The tactical advantage that had cost the RAF hundreds of planes and pilots had evaporated overnight. By mid-April, Beatrice's team had overseen the installation of restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines. Every operational Hurricane, every Spitfire, every reserve aircraft, the data that came out of fighter command was staggering. In March, before the restrictor was widespread, engine failures were reported in 38% of all diving attacks. That is nearly 4 out of every 10 attacks ending in a stalled engine. In April, after the restrictor, that number dropped to 0.4%. It was a statistical miracle. The failures that did happen were usually due to battle-damage bullets hitting the engine, not the carburetor flaw. The kill-to-loss ratio, the grim math of war, flipped. In March, for every British plane lost, they shot down 1.3 Germans. A fair fight, barely. In April, for every British plane lost, they shot down 3.2 Germans. The RAF was suddenly 3 times more lethal. And it wasn't because they had new planes. It wasn't because they had new pilots. It was because a woman on a motorcycle had given them the confidence to fly their machines to the absolute limit. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, a legend in the RAF, later said that the restrictor changed the psychology of the cockpit. Before, he felt like he was fighting with one hand tied behind his back. After the modification, he destroyed 3 German fighters in May alone. He said the brass washer gave him his aggression back. The Air Ministry had planned to replace the restrictors with the new pressure carburetors from Rolls-Royce in 1943. The pressure carburetor was the proper engineering solution, complex, expensive, and perfect. But a strange thing happened. The restrictor worked so well that the urgency for the expensive solution disappeared. Engineers began to ask, why spend millions re-engineering the entire fuel system when a 50-cent washer does the job? The restrictor was supposed to be a stopgap, a temporary bandage, But in war, if it works, you keep it. Many Spitfires and Hurricanes flew with Miss Schilling's orifice until the very last day of the war. Some pilots even preferred it to the newer systems because it was so simple. It couldn't break, it couldn't jam, it was just a hole in a piece of brass. Beatrice Schilling had done the impossible. She had taken a fatal flaw in the British war machine and fixed it with nothing but physics and intuition. But as the summer of 1941 approached, the war was evolving. The Battle of Britain had been won, but the conflict was spreading. Russia, North Africa, the Arctic, and with new battlefields came new problems. The Royal Aircraft Establishment knew they had a genius on their hands. They didn't let her rest. As soon as the carburetor crisis was stabilized, they dropped a new file on her desk. It was a problem coming from the frozen hell of the Russian front. The British were sending Spitfires to help the Soviets in Murmansk. But in the Russian winter, temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. At that temperature, oil turns into sludge, rubber snaps like glass, and engines simply refused to start. Pilots were sitting in freezing cockpits on Russian airfields, unable to turn their propellers while German bombers approached. They needed a solution. They needed it fast. And once again, they needed Beatrice Schilling. The war didn't stop at the English Channel, and neither did Beatrice Schilling. While the Battle of Britain had been fought in the mild skies of brave little England, the conflict was now spreading to the ends of the earth. And the next problem to land on Beatrice's desk came from a place where the air itself was trying to kill you. Murmansk, northern Russia, the Arctic Circle. The Royal Air Force had sent a wing of Spitfires to support the Soviet Union against the Nazi invasion. It was a gesture of solidarity, but it quickly turned into a logistical nightmare. In England, a cold morning meant frost on the grass. In Murmansk, cold meant 40 degrees below zero. At that temperature, physics changes. The standard aviation oil used in the Merlin engines didn't flow. It turned into a thick, black sludge, like tar. The rubber hoses in the fuel lines became brittle and snapped like dry twigs. The batteries that turned the propellers over died in minutes. British pilots would run to their aircraft as air raid sirens wailed, only to find their Spitfires were nothing more than frozen sculptures. They sat in the cockpits, mashing the starter buttons, listening to the heavy, groaning silence of a seized engine, while German bombers released their payloads overhead. It was a humiliating way to die. To be grounded by the weather, the engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment were stumped. They suggested heated hangars impossible on the makeshift Soviet airfields. They suggested keeping the engines running 24/7, a waste of fuel they couldn't spare. Beatrice didn't look for a structural solution. She looked at the chemistry. She understood that the heart of the problem was viscosity. The oil was too thick to move. So, she developed a procedure that seemed insane to any traditionally trained mechanic. She told the ground crews to dilute the oil with fuel. It was a terrifying concept. You were essentially deliberately contaminating the engine's lubrication system with something flammable. If you got the mixture wrong, you wouldn't just ruin the engine, you could blow the cylinder heads off. But Beatrice calculated the ratio perfectly. She designed a cold start protocol. The fuel thinned the oil just enough to let the engine turn over in the Arctic freeze. Once the engine fired and reached operating temperature, the heat would evaporate the fuel out of the oil, returning it to its normal viscosity. It was a brilliant, dangerous dance with chemistry. She wrote the manuals. She specified the preheating of the oil. She laid out the exact mixture, and in the frozen wasteland of Russia, the Spitfires roared to life. The Luftwaffe pilots, who assumed the British were grounded by the freeze, suddenly found themselves bounced by Hurricanes and Spitfires rising out of the snow. Beatrice had defeated the ice. But the war wasn't just moving north, it was moving up. By 1942 and 1943, the air war had climbed into the stratosphere. The new battleground was at 35,000 feet. At that altitude, the air is thin. There is barely any oxygen. A human being will pass out in seconds without a mask, and a combustion engine, which needs oxygen to burn fuel, begins to suffocate. The Merlin engines were gasping. The fuel mixture that worked perfectly at 10,000 feet was useless at 35,000. If the mixture was too rich, the engine flooded and drowned. If it was too lean, The engine burned hotter than the sun and melted its own pistons. Once again, the problem came to Beatrice. She wasn't just fixing parts anymore. She was tuning the lungs of the Royal Air Force. She dove into the research of high-altitude fuel mixtures. She worked on the supercharger systems, the mechanical lungs that forced air into the engine. She developed an altitude-compensating modification for the carburetor. It was a system that automatically sensed the thinning air and adjusted the fuel flow, leaner and leaner, as the plane climbed. The result? An 8% increase in power above 30,000 feet. 8% doesn't sound like much. But in a dogfight, 8% is the difference between being the hunter and being the prey. It was the difference between climbing above your enemy to drop on him, or stalling out below him and becoming a target. She was saving lives in Russia. She was saving lives in the stratosphere. She was arguably the most important engineer in the entire war effort. But every evening, Beatrice Schilling went home to a silence that was almost deafening. There was a part of her life that the history books often gloss over, but it is the key to understanding her intensity. She was married. Her husband was George Naylor. He was a brilliant man, an aerodynamicist who worked at the same research facility. But when the war started, George didn't stay in the lab. He volunteered. He joined Bomber Command. If you know the history of World War II, you know that Bomber Command was practically a death sentence. Fighter pilots like the ones Beatrice saved were the rock stars of the war. They were the knights of the sky. But the bomber crews? They were the workhorses. They flew heavy, slow Lancaster bombers deep into the heart of Nazi Germany, at night, through walls of flak and swarms of night fighters. The survival rate was horrific. Statistically, a bomber crewman had a worse chance of surviving the war than an infantryman in the trenches of WWI. 1 in every 2 men died. George Naylor was flying missions with the 625 Squadron. He was piloting a Lancaster into the dark, night after night. Beatrice knew the math. She was a woman of statistics. She knew exactly what the odds were. Every time George left for his base, she had to calculate the probability that she would never see him again. And the irony was cruel. She was the woman who saved the fighter pilots. She had given the Spitfires the edge they needed to survive. But she could do nothing for her husband. The problems facing a heavy bomber over Berlin weren't carburetor stalls. They were 88mm anti-aircraft shells and radar-guided night fighters. No brass washer could fix that. So, they lived in a compartmented silence. When George came home on leave, they didn't talk about the war. He didn't tell her about the flak bursting so close it rattled his teeth. He didn't tell her about the empty bunks in the barracks the next morning. And she didn't tell him about the frantic calls from station commanders or the pressure of the high-altitude tests. They kept it separate. It was a survival mechanism. If they acknowledged the danger, it might become too real to bear. George flew 31 combat missions. That is a full tour, +1. He survived the statistical meat grinder. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. Beatrice never stopped worrying, but she never let it slow her down. In fact, the stress seemed to fuel her. During the darkest days of the war, when the pressure of saving lives and the fear for her husband became too much, Beatrice would return to her first love. She would walk out to the shed and uncover her Norton motorcycle. The Brooklands racetrack, where she had won her gold star, was closed, dug up, and turned into a factory for Vickers aircraft. But the country roads were still there. She would kick the starter, feel the single-cylinder engine thump against her leg, and take off. She rode fast, recklessly fast. Witnesses said you could hear her coming from miles away, the roar of that tuned racing engine echoing off the hedgerows. She would hit 90 miles per hour on the narrow English lanes. For Beatrice, speed wasn't about thrill. It was about clarity. When you are moving at 90 miles per hour on a motorcycle, you cannot worry about your husband over Berlin. You cannot worry about the fuel mixture in a Spitfire at 30,000 feet. You have to be entirely in the moment. The only thing that matters is the next curve, the grip of the tires, the vibration of the engine. It was meditation at high velocity. Some of her best engineering breakthroughs didn't happen in the laboratory with a slide rule. They happened on the A30 highway, with the wind screaming in her ears, her mind finally free enough to see the simple solution that everyone else had missed. She rode to escape the war, so she could go back and win it. By 1944, the tide had turned. The Allies were pushing into France. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, largely thanks to the planes Beatrice had helped perfect. But as the war ground toward its end, the technology was shifting again. The age of the piston engine, the age of the Merlin, the propeller, the carburetor was dying. A new sound was being heard in the skies, a high-pitched whine, the sound of jets. The Germans had the Me-262. The British were developing the Meteor, the brass washer, the orifice that had saved 2,100 pilots, was about to become obsolete. But Beatrice Schilling wasn't. The end of the war wasn't the end of her story. In fact, she was about to step into an era of missiles, rockets, and nuclear threats. The woman who mastered the piston engine was about to take on the space age. May 1945. The guns finally fell silent. Germany surrendered. Japan followed in August. The great, terrible engine of World War II shuddered to a halt. For most of the world, it was a time of ticker-tape parades, street parties, and the overwhelming relief that they had survived. The pilots came home. The uniforms were packed away in mothballs. The brass restrictors, those little washers that had saved 2,100 lives, became scrap metal or souvenirs. But for Beatrice Schilling, peace wasn't an end. It was just a change of variables. The urgency of solve this or a pilot dies tomorrow was gone. But the curiosity remained. She had no intention of going back to the kitchen or fading into domestic life. Engineering wasn't what she did. It was who she was. In 1948, the Crown finally acknowledged what the pilots had known for years. Beatrice was summoned to Buckingham Palace. King George VI pinned the Order of the British Empire, OBE, to her dress. It was a formal affair. Beatrice, who lived in leather riding gear and oil-stained lab coats, stood awkwardly in her finery. She smiled for the cameras. She accepted the medal. It was a high honor, official recognition that she had served her country with distinction. Most people would have ridden that wave of glory into a comfortable administrative job. Beatrice didn't. The very next morning, the OBE medal was in a drawer, and Beatrice was back at Farnborough, hands deep in an engine, looking for the next problem. And the problems were getting faster. The world had entered the jet age. The Royal Air Force was trading its propellers for turbines. The speeds jumped from 400 miles per hour to 600, then 700. The sound barrier was being broken. Beatrice adapted instantly. She didn't mourn the past. She attacked the future. One of the new killers in this era wasn't enemy fire. It was rain. Heavy jet aircraft landing on wet runways were crashing. They were hydroplaning, skidding off the tarmac like stones on a lake. The brakes did nothing. The tires lost contact. Pilots were surviving supersonic flight, only to die in a fiery wreck 10 seconds after touching the ground. Beatrice dove into the physics of friction. She studied the interaction between rubber, water, and concrete at high velocities. She published 3 major technical papers on runway braking effects. Her research helped redesign tires and runway surfaces. Once again, she was saving pilots who would never know her name, protecting them from simple, brutal physics. She even worked on the Blue Streak missile program. Britain's attempt at a nuclear ballistic missile. Think about that range. She started her career fixing carburetors on biplanes, and she ended up working on the fuel systems for rockets designed to leave the atmosphere. She spanned the entire history of modern flight in a single career. But perhaps the most delightful project, the one that showed her unique spirit, came from the Winter Olympics. The Royal Air Force bobsled team was struggling. They were brave men, but their sled was slow. They came to Beatrice. Most aeronautical engineers would have laughed. A bobsled? It's a toy. Beatrice took it seriously. To her, a bobsled was just an aircraft that didn't fly. It was an exercise in aerodynamics, drag reduction, and friction management. She applied the same rigorous math she used on the Spitfire to the sled. She redesigned the cowling. She tweaked the weight distribution. The RAF team took her sled to the competition. They didn't win gold, they were pilots, not professional athletes, but they didn't crash. And the sled was fast. It was a classic Beatrice Schilling solution. Weird, unexpected, and technically perfect. Yet, despite all this, the missiles, the jets, the bobsleds, the medals, There was a ceiling she couldn't break. Beatrice worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment for 33 continuous years. She was, by all accounts, one of the most brilliant minds in the building, but she never became a director. She never reached the top of the administrative ladder. Those jobs were for men. The RAF leadership structure in the 1952nd and 62nd simply could not conceive of a woman running a department. It didn't matter that she had saved Fighter Command in 1941. It didn't matter that she had an OBE. She was a woman, and there was a limit to how high she could climb. It must have stung. It had to. To see men she had trained, men with half her talent, promoted above her simply because they wore trousers. But Beatrice never complained publicly. She never gave an interview bitter about the patriarchy. Why? Because she didn't want the desk. Beatrice Schilling was an engineer's engineer. She hated paperwork. She hated meetings. She hated the politics of management. If they had made her a director, she would have been stuck in an office, signing forms. By keeping her in the technical ranks, the RAF accidentally gave her exactly what she wanted: the work. They left her alone in the lab and on the test track, where she could get her hands dirty. She stayed until 1969. When she finally retired at age 60, the world had changed completely. Man had walked on the moon. The Concorde was flying. The computer age was dawning. Beatrice packed up her tools. She said goodbye to the colleagues who had become family. She walked out of the gates of Farnborough for the last time. She went home to her husband, George. They were older now. The war was a distant memory. But there was one thing that hadn't changed. In her garage, under a tarp, sat the 1934 Norton motorcycle. She had bought it when she was 25. She had raced it at Brooklands. She had ridden it to RAF Kenley with a satchel full of brass washers to save the Spitfires. She had ridden it through the terrifying nights of the Blitz. It was an old machine now, outdated, obsolete, just like the piston engines she used to fix. But Beatrice didn't sell it. She restored it. She spent her retirement years in the garage, stripping the engine down, polishing the valves, tuning the carburetor. She raced it in classic motorcycle events. Imagine the scene. A grey-haired woman in her 70s, leathers worn soft with age, kicking over a roaring vintage motorcycle and tearing down a track, leaning into the corners with the same intuition she had used to diagnose the Merlin engine. She was still fast. She was still sharp. But time, unlike an engine, cannot be fixed with a brass washer. In the late 1980s, her health began to fail. The woman who had defeated gravity and friction finally faced an opponent she couldn't out-engineer. Beatrice Schilling died on November 18, 1990. She was 81 years old. There were no air raid sirens, no scrambling fighters, no roar of Merlin engines. She passed away in the quiet of peacetime, survived by her husband George, and a lifetime of solved problems. When the obituaries appeared in the British newspapers, they didn't focus on her work with nuclear missiles. They didn't talk much about the bobsleds or the runway friction tests. They talked about the washer. They talked about Miss Schilling's orifice. It is a strange thing to have a life of 81 years defined by a piece of metal the size of a fingernail. Beatrice had worked on the cutting edge of aerospace technology for 3 decades. She had helped usher Britain into the space age. But history has a way of filtering out the noise and finding the signal. And the signal of Beatrice Schilling's life was that moment in 1941, the moment she stood on a freezing tarmac, looked at a problem that was killing her countrymen, and solved it with 50 cents worth of brass. In the years after her death, the world finally began to catch up to her genius. For a long time, she was just a footnote, a trivia question for aviation nerds. But as historians looked closer at the Battle of Britain and the years that followed, Beatrice's name started to rise to the surface. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough, the town where she spent her life working, was renamed. They took down the old sign and put up a new one. The Tilly Schilling. It's a British tradition. You know you are a legend when you get a pub named after you. It's where soldiers and engineers drink. It's a place of noise and life. Beatrice would have liked that. In 2015, the Brooklands Museum, the place where she earned her Gold Star racing, that Norton motorcycle bought her collection of trophies. They put them on display, not just as racing memorabilia, but as the artifacts of a woman who refused to stay in her lane. In 2019, on what would have been her 110th birthday, the mayor of Waterlooville unveiled a plaque in her honor. But the real legacy of Beatrice Schilling isn't in pubs or plaques. It isn't even in the history books. It is in the bloodlines of thousands of families who don't even know her name. Think about the math. The records state that the restrictor saved an estimated 200 pilots a month during the peak of the crisis. Over the course of the war, the number is cited at around 2,000. 100 pilots saved from fatal engine failures or defenseless deaths during stalls. 2,100 men. Those men didn't crash in 1941. They came home. They married. They had children. Those children had children. Today, there are tens of thousands of people walking around in London, in Toronto, in Sydney, in New York who exist solely because Beatrice Schilling drilled a 0.04-inch hole in a piece of brass. If that washer hadn't worked, their grandfather or great-grandfather would have been a smoking crater in a French field. The family line would have ended there. That is the power of engineering. That is the power of the 50-cent solution. Today, in engineering schools around the world, professors still use the restrictor as the ultimate case study. They teach it to young students who are obsessed with coding, AI, and complex algorithms. They show them the diagram of the Merlin engine. They explain the complex fluid dynamics of the flooding carburetor, and then they show the washer. The lesson is simple. Complexity is not a virtue. It is easy to make something complex. It is easy to throw money and technology at a problem until it disappears. The pressure carburetor that Rolls-Royce eventually built in 1943 was a masterpiece of complexity. It had hundreds of moving parts. It cost a fortune. Beatrice's washer had 0 moving parts. It cost pennies. And it worked. It is a reminder that sometimes the answer isn't a new computer system. Sometimes the answer is just looking at the physics, ignoring the rulebook, and doing the one thing that actually works. Beatrice Schilling was an outlier. She was a woman in a man's world who didn't try to act like a man. She didn't wear the uniform. She didn't shout orders. She just brought her tools. She rode her motorcycle fast because it cleared her head. She fixed engines because she understood their pain. She saved the Royal Air Force because she couldn't stand to see good pilots die for bad reasons. As we look back at the titans of World War II, Churchill, Eisenhower, Patton, we see the men who moved armies on maps. But wars are also won in the workshops. They are won by the people who stay up all night, staring at blueprints, trying to figure out why the oil is freezing or why the engine is stalling. Beatrice Schilling was one of those silent warriors. She didn't fire a gun. She didn't drop a bomb. She just gave the good guys the power to fly. And in the end, that made all the difference. If this story moved you, if you believe that heroes like Beatrice Schilling deserve to be remembered just as much as the generals, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. It sounds small, but every single like tells the YouTube algorithm that this history matters. It helps us push this video out to more people, so Beatrice's story doesn't disappear into the archives. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We are digging up forgotten stories from the war every single week. Stories of courage, ingenuity, and the human spirit. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Are you in Texas, Germany, the UK, Australia? We have a community here that spans the globe. Also, tell me, had you ever heard of Beatrice Schilling before today? Or was this the first time? Let's keep the conversation going in the comments. Thank you for watching. Thank you for respecting the history, and I'll see you in the next one.